Hello, my name is Hallie, and welcome to this investigation of demography. I'm sure most of us could give a very good definition of what demographics is, but in this review, we're going to go beyond just the basic definition of demography. We're also going to look at how changes in a geographical area can influence the makeup of that population, such as the economic progression from an agrarian society to a more industrialized one. And by completing this review, you'll have a better understanding of the factors that influence the demographic makeup of a population, and of particular interest to us, you'll also be able to predict how those changes in demographics will influence the healthcare that's available to that population. And you'll also be able to approach questions such as the one at the bottom of the screen, which asks you to predict how changes in a population will influence the projected demographic makeup of that population. Let's begin by first defining demography. And demography comes from the roots demo and graphy, meaning the study of people. And this is the statistical analysis of people at the population level. And sometimes this is a very formal process, such as the one that's conducted by the U.S. Census Bureau, which polls the entire U.S. population every 10 years. But the collection of demographics can also be a very informal process. For example, a professor may poll his class to determine the average age of his students. Identifying the demographics of our population helps us to understand the characteristics of our population at a certain point in time, and it gives us a better understanding of how individuals behave and allows us to divide the population into subsets. For the purposes of Test 8, there are 6 key categories that we'll want to be familiar with, and the 6 categories are gender, age, ethnicity, race, sexual orientation, and immigration status. Classically, gender and age have been the 2 most common characteristics that divide people into their social groups. Now, don't confuse gender with sex. These are actually not the same thing. Sex is biologically determined. So if you have 2 X chromosomes, you are female. If you have an X and a Y chromosome, you are male. However, gender is a person who has the behavioral, cultural, or psychological traits associated with a biological sex. We tend to associate certain behaviors with each of these genders. For example, we usually think of men as being the stronger gender and that they should be the breadwinner of the household, while women are traditionally regarded as the kinder gender, where they're more loving and nurturing and tend to spend more time with their children. And this has led to gender inequality, where in general, men were given better opportunities. And this is an issue that's still active in modern day society. However, for the purposes of the MCAT, we don't need to take a political stance. We just need to recognize that historically there has been asymmetry between the genders. A person's age also has a significant impact on how we perceive them. And in the US, this has had a huge impact on healthcare because our citizens are getting older. Approximately 40% of the patients in our hospitals right now are over the age of 65, and this affects how we approach our patients. This also has an influence in the job market, both towards the young and the old, because of discrimination due to ageism. For example, an employer may consider someone who has recently graduated from college to be too immature or inexperienced to do the job well, while an older applicant may be considered unpredictable because who knows when they're going to retire and are they able to keep up with the technology. A person's ethnicity or race, like their age, also has a huge influence on how we perceive them. Ethnicity is a social construct that categorizes people into groups that they tend to identify with naturally. And for ethnicity, this is usually done based off of cultural factors, such as what language a person speaks or what religion they practice. For example, a group of people may consider themselves Hispanic, but not all Hispanic people are from the same nationality. We tend to group them because they speak the same language, most of them practice the same religion. There's also symbolic ethnicity, and this is when people who are of a certain descent only associate with their ethnicity on certain days out of the year and don't make it part of their everyday life. Great example of this is St. Patrick's Day, where there are many Americans who are of Irish descent, but they don't think about their cultural background on a day-to-day basis. But there's this one day a year where we put on the green shirt and the green hats and wear the crazy clovers and identify ourselves as being Irish. Race is a social construct as well, where we are able to categorize people, but these are based off of real or perceived phenotypes or physical traits, such as skin color. So an individual can control how their ethnicity is presented, but that same person cannot control if their race is being perceived by the people around them. And even though an individual may belong to two different ethnic or racial groups, there's usually one group that they have a stronger connection with or feel closer to. The fifth demographic category that we'll want to know for test day is sexual orientation, and this is defined as a person's interest in their sexual endeavors, and this can be directed towards people of the same sex, opposite sex, or towards both sexes. And gender and sexual minorities tend to be grouped together. Now, these aren't the same thing. Gender minorities usually refers to people who are transgender, while sexual minorities usually refers to the lesbian or gay population. But they tend to associate with each other for political reasons. Sexual minorities also have some disadvantages when it comes to healthcare. For example, back in the 1980s, the HIV/AIDS epidemic disproportionately affected gay men. And with better safe sex practices and screenings, the epidemic has slowed down. Lesbians are also at a greater risk for cervical cancer because they are not screened properly because they don't report themselves as being sexually active with men. And there is a disparity when it comes to mental health issues. Youth who identify themselves in a sexual minority category are often bullied or victimized, while the adult minority population often struggles with depression and anxiety. The final demographic category is immigration status, and immigrants fall into one of two categories. They're either documented or undocumented, and they do have some interesting healthcare challenges. For one thing, there's a language barrier, and they have a difficult time effectively communicating with healthcare providers and navigating the complexity of the U.S. healthcare system. And undocumented immigrants tend to have a fear of deportation, and this becomes an issue because they let routine healthcare problems run untreated because they're afraid that they'll be sent out of the United States, and for that reason these minor problems become expensive, complex diseases that turn into emergencies. Immigration into the U.S. has been a major contributor of the overall population growth of this country. However, let's take a moment to look at the other factors that contribute to our overall population growth. Let's identify the rates that influence the changes in our population. So if we start with the general population of this country, we'll see that the fertility rate, which is defined as the number of children a woman will have in her lifetime, contributes to the population. To maintain the current population size, we would expect the fertility rate to be somewhere around 2.1 children per woman, and currently the U.S. averages somewhere between 2.3 and 2.1 children per woman. So the population isn't growing at a particularly fast rate, but this is contributing to the amount of people living in this country. And although we are elaborating on the exact rates in this review, don't worry about memorizing them for test day. Just have a general ballpark of what these rates would be. So the fertility rate contributes to the growth of the population, and the population is then decreased by the mortality rate, which is defined as the number of deaths per 1,000 people per year. Currently, the mortality rate in the U.S. is somewhere between 7 and 8 deaths per 1,000 people. When these two rates are in balance with each other, the population will stay static. However, migration also influences the number of people living in this country. So as people immigrate into the country, it will add to the population, and as people emigrate out, the population will be decreased. Demographic shift is based on the statistics of an economically static population. However, demographic transition defines how birth rates and mortality rates will change in a population as it changes from an agricultural society to an industrialized economy. And we see this occur in 4 stages. The first being the agricultural society, where there's a high fertility rate, but there's also a high mortality rate. And so the population remains in equilibrium. Basically, people are born as quickly as they die. As the society moves into a more industrialized economy, we see that the mortality rate will decrease, and the fertility rate will also decrease, but at a later time. And this is why the population will grow, because the mortality rate will drop off before the fertility rate. And then as the society becomes an industrialized economy, we will see a lower fertility rate, predominantly because the child mortality rate has also decreased. We'll also see a decrease in mortality rate because we have better health care available, and this will keep the population in equilibrium. However, do note that the population is much larger in the industrial society than the agricultural society. Beyond the changes in fertility and mortality rate, there are other factors that contribute to the changes in a demographic, such as industrialization, which is the mass production of a product, and this makes more jobs or more economic opportunities available to the population. There will also be an increase in medical breakthroughs, which will in turn decrease the mortality rate, and people will start moving into denser populations or cities in order to seek jobs, and will be able to start importing and exporting goods and tap into other markets. Well, let's try some practice questions, such as this one, which asks us to analyze the demographic characteristics of the undocumented immigrant and predict what changes in our healthcare system would help these people to seek additional healthcare services. And the correct answer is B. Since some undocumented immigrants do have a fear of deportation, it may be in the clinic's best interest to relax their identification rules in order to get more of these patients into their healthcare system. We can also attack questions such as this one, which asks us to identify the impact of demographic shifts for job projections that are based on the needs of elderly care in this demographic. And the correct answer is D. If the mortality rate increases, then there'll be fewer elderly patients seeking care, and therefore fewer caregivers required to take care of them. We can also approach questions which ask us to identify how a state's change in economic status, such as the availability of jobs, will influence the demographic shift into or out of the state. And the correct answer is C. The question stem didn't provide any information that would suggest that the fertility or mortality rate would change, but due to the presence of new jobs, we would certainly see migration into the state. Let's highlight the key points that we want to remember for test day. Demography is the study of people at the population level, and we group these people into categories based off of their demographic structure. Demographic shifts describe how fertility, mortality, and migration contribute to population growth, while demographic transition describes how population growth is affected by changes in the economy. Well, congratulations on completing this review. These topics are not only relevant to the behavioral sciences portion of your MCAT, but they also raise some interesting questions and ideas that will be relevant to our own clinical careers. Thank you for joining me, and as always, best of luck on your MCAT.